In a quiet and elegant house, located in the heart of a bustling city, Claire lived a peaceful life. The kind of life that many envied without knowing that it was in reality tinged with small gray areas. Surrounded by her husband, Mark, an international business consultant, and their 2 children, Camille and Hugo, Claire had built a comfortable, almost perfect existence. The days passed with a familiar routine. The children left for school at dawn. The morning was devoted to housework, preparing lunch and handling small domestic emergencies, while Mark, always absorbed in his demanding work, disappeared into the twists and turns of his meetings, often not returning until late in the evening, exhausted and distant. Claire had become accustomed to this dynamic. She had learned to deal with loneliness in the house, to fill Mark's silences with her own thoughts, and to take care of the children while juggling her own career as an artist in interior design. Their marriage was calm, without great excesses or crises, but also without the spark of the beginning. However, she still believed in love, in complicity. Until that evening. That evening, a strange feeling hung in the air. Claire felt it without knowing exactly where this tension that seemed to creep between the walls of the house came from. It all started like an ordinary evening, a leisurely dinner prepared with care. The children had eaten, rushed to their respective rooms, and the evening began at its usual pace. Mark and Claire alone, enjoying a glass of wine, a little too much silence in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. But that evening, there was something else. This something happened when Mark announced, with a lightness that surprised Claire, that his nephew Lucas was going to spend the night at their house. Lucas, a young man of 19, whom Claire had always found charming and respectful. The boy had grown up in a neighboring family, and although a few years younger, he had always seemed close to Claire and Mark. She had often said to herself that he was more like a friend than a nephew, the boy to whom Mark was attached like a son. He had just returned from a trip abroad, and Mark thought it would be a good idea to have him over for a few days, to spend time together. But Claire couldn't help but feel that there was something different about this invitation. There was a tension in Mark's eyes, a slight unease that she couldn't explain, a discomfort that she did not recognize as coming from Lucas, but rather from her husband. Lucas was smiling as usual, but a strange glint in his eyes betrayed something Claire couldn't grasp. The evening then began pleasantly. They dined together, exchanged travel anecdotes, laughed at Lucas' little misadventures. The 3 men seemed to understand each other perfectly, as if a special bond had been forged between them over the years. Mark seemed less distant than usual, laughing frankly, letting himself indulge in the discussions. This soothed Claire. She said to herself that perhaps he simply needed this meeting to relax, to get away from his daily life as a consultant. But, deep down, a presentiment remained within her. After dinner, the children retired to their rooms, and Claire expected the evening to end quietly. However, Mark, with a relaxed air, announced that Lucas wanted to stay with her for an evening of video games. He wants to make up for lost time, he explained. You know, it's a rare opportunity to chat with him. You've always had a good bond, Claire. Mark seemed sincere, but there was an insistence in his words that disturbed Claire a little. She accepted without protest, although a strange shiver ran through her skin. It must be said that she had always loved these moments when she and Lucas played together, laughing at the same jokes, sharing childhood memories, their obvious complicity. But this time something was not like before. There was a pressure in the air, an emotional charge that she couldn't understand. Claire, to try to chase away these thoughts, got up and went to get the video games in the living room. She told herself that it would end up being just another evening, but suddenly she realized that time seemed to be stretching out in a strange way. Lucas, although enthusiastic and charming, seemed more tactile than usual, more insistent in his looks. There he was, sitting next to her on the couch, almost too close. Claire found herself embarrassed by a proximity she had not anticipated. And as they got deeper and deeper into video games, the intensity of the situation increased. The apparent normality of the evening became an increasingly heavy weight. Claire felt this uneasiness growing, a feeling that slipped under her skin like an icy breeze. But what she didn't know, what Mark also didn't know, was that this choice, to let Lucas and Claire spend this night together, was going to be the catalyst for revelations that no one was ready to face. At first, everything seemed trivial. Claire and Lucas sat comfortably on the sofa, controllers in hand, ready to dive into a virtual world. Video games were, after all, a mundane activity they had shared in the past. Claire had always found in these moments a certain lightness, a way to disconnect from the daily routine and enjoy the innocence of childish distraction. Mark, for his part, seemed happy that his nephew was spending time with his wife, as if this little moment of complicity allowed them to rediscover a little of their youth. And at first, everything went well. The evening passed peacefully.
The sound of the games echoed in the house, and Claire and Lucas' laughter mixed with the sound of the controllers.
The atmosphere was relaxed, almost warm. Claire felt like she was reliving moments when her children were still at home, their little voices filling the empty spaces of everyday life. But as she got caught up in the spirit of the game, she felt something strange creeping into the air, a subtle tension she couldn't quite identify. She had always found Lucas charming, a brilliant, respectful young man, always ready to help. He was far from being the turbulent teenager one might imagine, and Claire had often considered him a bit of a role model, a boy who had been able to forge a future for himself, despite the difficulties of life. They had shared light conversations, sincere laughter, and although Claire had always been a slightly more maternal figure in his eyes, she had never had reason to distrust him. But that night, things seemed to have changed, imperceptibly, but unsettlingly. Lucas was no longer the same. The way he looked at her had changed. His eyes, usually full of candor, were now more intense, almost observant, as if he were trying to unravel a hidden secret. Eyes met often, a little longer than usual. Claire, at first absorbed by the light of the screens and the speed of the game, realized that she was increasingly aware of her own discomfort. There was a sense of expectation in the air, a silent pressure that destabilized her. She found herself avoiding his eyes, looking away every time their eyes met. But Lucas seemed insistent, as if he was waiting for her to see what he was showing her without daring to say it. The proximity, too, had become more marked. They were sitting on the sofa, of course, but every movement, every gesture seemed to want to reduce the space between them. There were no inappropriate gestures, but the way Lucas leaned slightly towards her to comment on a part of the game, or the way he brushed her arms without realizing it, disturbed Claire in a way she couldn't explain. These small gestures, at first glance innocent, began to bother her. And yet, she felt guilty for this embarrassment. Maybe she was exaggerating. Perhaps his mind, tired from the routine of the day, was playing tricks on him. As the evening progressed, the line between play and reality seemed to blur. Claire, at first full of enthusiasm, began to feel a slight fatigue settling in her body. However, Lucas seemed to have found new energy. His eyes shone with an almost feverish glow, an elusive energy that he didn't want to let go. At one point, after a long game, he suggested continuing to play until the morning. He insisted, his lips slightly pursed, as if waiting for a precise answer. Claire, a little tired but still curious, accepted. The idea of spending a night playing, as a break from freedom, seemed pleasant at that precise moment.
A way to escape, to feel young again.
But deep inside her, a little voice whispered that this wasn't quite normal. Why insist so much on spending a whole night playing? Usually, these evenings ended well before midnight. It wasn't like Lucas to be so persistent. And it wasn't his fault either, to stay up at such late hours for no good reason. As the evening slowly turned into morning, Claire began to feel more and more trapped. The atmosphere in the room, initially light and carefree, had become heavier. Each burst of laughter, each reply from Lucas seemed to stretch, to intensify. There were no explicit gestures, no words that crossed a clear boundary, but a growing closeness that seeped into every movement. Lucas was becoming more and more tactile, brushing against her arms, leaning in more insistently when he wanted to speak to her. His actions, previously innocent, now had a certain intention, an implication that Claire could not ignore, despite her efforts to push it to a corner of her mind. At first, she thought she was imagining things, that it was her own fatigue playing tricks on her, but little by little, she understood that the discomfort she felt was not imaginary. What scared her the most was how powerless she felt to change things. to get out of this situation without causing a breakup she didn't want to face. She felt like she was slipping into a trap that her husband seemed to have set without her seeing it coming. Then, the question that had been floating in her mind for a while, without her daring to express it out loud, became more pressing. Why had Mark, her husband, allowed her to spend the whole night playing with Lucas? Why had he opened this door, allowed this proximity? He, who was always so protective and so attentive to family dynamics, how could he have allowed such a situation without intervening, without worrying about the latent unease that was being felt? What initially seemed like a simple video game evening, a way to please his nephew, was increasingly revealing itself as a calculated setup. Claire realized, almost too late, that she had never really asked her husband these questions. She had never doubted him, his intentions. However, that evening, a seed of distrust began to germinate. What hadn't Mark told him? And above all, why did he allow him to find himself in such an ambiguous situation with Lucas? Feeling overwhelmed by this series of unanswered questions, Claire decided it was time to take a step back, to breathe. She abruptly got up from the sofa, pretending that she was going to get a glass of water. But when she headed towards the kitchen, the feeling of being watched didn't leave her. The sound of Lucas' footsteps was heard behind her, but Claire hurried into the dark room, hoping to escape the growing pressure weighing on her. She tried to concentrate on the trivial task of pouring some water into a glass, trying to calm the frantic beating of her heart. It was then that she saw something on the counter, a note, folded neatly. Next to an empty coffee cup, she froze when she recognized Mark's handwriting. She grabbed it quickly, feeling apprehension creeping into her gut. The note seemed to be written in a hurry, as if Mark had wanted her to read it at that precise moment. She unfolded the sheet, the words etching themselves in her mind, heavy with meaning. Claire, I know this night seems strange to you, but it's time for you to see the truth.
Lucas is not what you think.
There are things I haven't told you yet. She didn't have time to read further. The kitchen door opened suddenly, and Lucas entered, his steps measured, his gaze insistent. Claire turned around immediately, a pang of panic washing over her. She didn't need to ask the question out loud. She knew Lucas was there to give her the answers. But deep down, she feared what he might say to her more than anything. What's really going on here, Lucas? She asked, her voice tense, but firm. Why did Mark let us do this? He stopped a few steps in front of her, his gaze intently fixed on her, almost heavy with meaning. Claire scrutinized him, waiting for an answer that, she knew, would change everything. Lucas took a long breath before breaking the silence, his voice low, almost secretive. Mark allowed me to spend this night with you because he wanted you to finally know how he really feels. He asked me to send you a message. Claire then felt the ground give way beneath her. The words echoed like a clap of thunder in his mind, invading every corner of his consciousness. The truth, the real reason for this evening, was unfolding before her, but in a way she could never have imagined. It's not what you think, Claire, Lucas continued, his eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. Mark didn't want you to just be here with me, he wanted you to see reality. He asked me to push you, to increase the tension between us so that you understand what he kept to himself for a long time. He told me that it was the only way to make you open your eyes. Words raced through Claire's mind, but none of them seemed able to come out. She felt like a helpless spectator in her own life, besieged by the revelations slowly unfolding before her. Why had Mark orchestrated all of this? Why allowed her to find herself like this, caught in a trap by her own husband, manipulated by the man she had always believed to be her unwavering support? The pieces of the puzzle slowly began to come together in his mind, but each new piece brought more confusion and pain. Mark had played a game with her, a dangerous game, and Claire was beginning to understand that perhaps he was more involved in this night of video games than she had imagined. But why? What was he really hoping to accomplish by pushing her to this extent? His thoughts swirled in an uncontrollable whirlwind, while Lucas, silent, waited for Claire's reaction.